Hello there. This is the story of Pythagoras. And I think I mentioned earlier that when I became a substitute teacher, one of the things that I did was I came up with a collection of stories that I could tell my students. Whether I was teaching a math class, I would have a math story, or I was teaching science, I would have a science story, or I was teaching history, I'd have a history story. So this story is a story that I would tell my students when I was teaching a math class, and it's the story of Pythagoras. And a lot of times I would go in, this would be for high school math. I would go into a high school classroom, math classroom, and I would say, does everybody here know the Pythagorean theorem? And of course everybody would say, yes, Ms. Wagner, we know the Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. And I'd say, oh, very good. Does anybody here know the story of Pythagoras? Nobody knew. So this is the story of Pythagoras. And I got to, first of all, give you a little bit of backstory. And I'm going to go back to a couple hundred years BC to Greece. And it was on the countryside. And the herdsmen and the shepherds there noticed that when their sheep and when their goats were at a particular part on the mountainside, that they started acting a little bit funny. And what they did was they went over to this section of the mountainside and they realized that there was a pit, and out of the pit were coming fumes. And these fumes were making their animals act funny. Well, the legend has it that it was the god Apollo who slew the python and threw the python into the pit. And out of the pit came these fumes, these vapors from the decaying body. Well, the townspeople knew that this was a real special part of the mountainside. So what they did was they separated it. Not everybody could go to this part of the mountainside, and only certain people had the right or the privilege to go to this pit. And what they did was they put a tripod over the pit, and there were women, priestess, who sat on the tripod. And as the fumes came up from the pit, these women would go into a trance. These priestesses would go into a trance. And when they would go into a trance, they would prophesy. And as they would prophesy, there were men sitting around, and there was a mystical formula that they would use to translate, to transcribe what these priestesses were saying. And this became known as the Oracle at Delphi. And so many, many people would go to the Oracle at Delphi to find out their future, their prophecy. Well, on one such occasion, there was a businessman and his wife from Syria. And he had transacted his business deals, and then he said to his wife, let's go to the Oracle at Delphi to see if we're going to have a safe trip back. So they went to the Oracle, and they asked if they were going to have a safe trip back. And the Oracle didn't respond to that question. Instead, she prophesied that the wife was going to become pregnant, and that she was going to have a baby boy, and that this baby boy would influence generations to come, that he was going to be very, very smart. And not only was he going to be very, very smart, but he was also going to be very, very handsome. They were like, wow, blown away. Couldn't believe it. He went back home, and sure enough, the wife got pregnant. And when the child was born, they called the child Pythagoras, after the python at the Oracle at Delphi. So what happened was they got him the best tutors, the best teachers, and he excelled in everything. And by the time he got to be a teenager, most of his teachers knew that Pythagoras was really a very special student. And they encouraged him to go to Egypt. So you're probably thinking, why Egypt? Well, Egypt was where all the very top schools were, the mystery schools. It's kind of like today, if you had a student in your class and you say, wow, you really should go to Stanford or Harvard or UCLA. I went to UCLA. So what happened was Pythagoras went to Egypt. But when he got to Egypt, nobody knew him. Nobody had heard of him. And he wanted to get into the schools, but he's like, I really want to go to this school. But they said, we don't know who you are, get lost. Well, anyway, Pythagoras, as the story goes, stayed outside the gate of Heliopolis for 7 years. And then they thought, gee, I guess this guy really wants to go to this school. So they let him into the mystery schools, and they told him everything, and he just absorbed everything. And he was there for 25 years. So he's taken in a lot of knowledge, a lot of wisdom. And then when he got out of the schools, he did some traveling. He traveled through Persia, traveled through India, and then he made his way back to what is today Italy. And he set up a school in Italy. And everybody wanted to go to that school because he was brilliant. He was so smart. Well, the way the story goes is that, yes, Pythagoras was incredibly smart, and he had a lot of wisdom and a lot of knowledge and a lot of training. But one of the things that it takes to be a great teacher, a good teacher at least, is you need to have patience. Boy, do you need patience to be a teacher. And that's really not something that you can learn from books or learn from a school. You just kind of have to learn from it, from experience. So the way the story goes is that Pythagoras was dealing with one student who just wasn't getting it. And no matter how many times Pythagoras went over it, the student wasn't getting it. Pythagoras finally just lost his patience with him. I can't deal with you anymore. And the student felt terrible because he loved Pythagoras. He loved him. He wanted to please him. And so just in a fit of despair, the student pulled out his dagger and killed himself in front of Pythagoras. Dropped dead at his feet. Oh, can you imagine? Well, anyway, Pythagoras learned how to be patient with his students. And they say that from that day on, Pythagoras never said an unkind word, or never lost his patience with any of his students. Quite a story, huh? Quite a way to learn patience. Anyway, the way the story goes is that Pythagoras' school was very successful. But not everybody could get into it, okay? Not everybody gets into Harvard. Not everybody gets into Stanford. Not everybody gets into UCLA. And one such student just couldn't take the rejection. So he set the school on fire. And they say that Pythagoras' students formed a human bridge, and Pythagoras was able to walk over that human bridge and escaped without being burned. Another story says that Pythagoras actually burned in the flames. We don't know. And then there's actually another story about Pythagoras that said that he was crucified, but the church kind of put an end to that story because they didn't want that story to compete with the story of another very great teacher. So we don't know where Pythagoras is buried, or we don't really even know how he died. But we do know that he influenced generations to come with the Pythagorean theorem. So the next time somebody asks you if you know the Pythagorean theorem, you can say a squared plus b squared equals c squared. But you also know the story of the man behind the Pythagorean theorem. And that's a story to live by. Take care. Bye-bye.